A quick warning for listeners. This episode mentions some forms of violence and trauma and discusses the existence of ideas and terms that could bring up painful issues for many gender nonconforming people. Please take care of yourself and don't be afraid to reach out if you need help. We've listed some resources in our show notes. With the topic of gender diversity being in the news today, you might think it's something new. But anthropologists like Sharon Davies say, think again.
The Western world thinks it's getting very progressive in terms of accommodating non-binary genders at the bottom of people's emails and other things like, aren't we good? We're finally acknowledging that you can be he, she, or they. But in other places, that's always been the case.
Around the world, gender diversity isn't the exception. It's fairly common. And as Rabbi Shira Stutman, who we chatted with on our last episode, likes to point out, you can even find it in the Judeo-Christian tradition, if you look back far enough.
In Judaism, we have 6 different genders. And we cannot map these genders exactly onto any sort of understandings of gender categories in 2023. It wouldn't work. But the important part is that even 2,000 years ago, the rabbis understand that restricting gender to male and female was not only overly restrictive, it was false.
Over time, this understanding of gender fell out of the mainstream in Jewish discourse. But in many other traditions, things played out differently. On today's episode, we'll explore some of that history and ask, what does the world look like when you let go of gender binary logic? We'll hear more from Sharon Davies about the multiple genders recognized by the Bugis people from Sulawesi, and how this understanding plays out in their social and spiritual life. And we'll also talk to Osage therapist and artist Marka Cassidy about the meaning of the term two-spirit and how it can help Native people heal and reconnect with the gender-diverse traditions that were the default in many cultures before European colonization.
This is a rediscovery. This is a reclaiming. This is the wave we are in as Native people. You can see it in literature, film, TV, music, fashion. It's happening as well as in gender and sexuality, the decolonization. And so I'm on a mission.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
When I was born, the English language had nothing really to describe gender and sexual diversity. We had men, women, and maybe transvestite, which kind of meant a man who liked to dress up in his wife's dresses when she was out. We started to get a little bit into transsexual when surgery was allowing people to physically change their bodies, and that was kind of the limits of our understanding.
Professor Sharon Davies teaches Indonesian studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And as we heard at the top of this episode, she's a fan of reminding people that when it comes to ideas around gender diversity, the US and Europe aren't on the cutting edge. If anything, they look a bit more like late bloomers.
But it really wasn't until the 1990s and even 2000s that we started getting the word transgender. And so it's a really recent way in English of thinking about this notion of transgender. But if we look at places like Sulawesi, there has always been ways of thinking about being that are beyond just two gender binaries.
The man-woman binary is so fundamental in Western culture that the first question we often ask new parents isn't, how's the baby doing? But, is it a boy or a girl? Gender is one of the first boxes we check on forms to identify ourselves. In fact, in many European languages, the idea of gender runs so deep that even objects are masculine or feminine. For instance, in Spanish, the word for tree, árbol, is masculine. The word for flower, flor, is feminine. One thing we know from psychological science, though, is that language and perception are pretty intertwined. So thinking carefully about some of the most basic words we use can offer some pretty deep insight into how we see the world.
One example of how we can see the preference different societies give to gender is by how we talk about our family. So if I'm to say to you, I have a sister, what can you immediately tell about my sister?
I would assume she's biologically female.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the important thing. So I have a female woman sister. That's the important thing. Whether she's older or younger than me, you would have no idea, because in English language it's not important. The important thing is I have a sister and I have a brother, and we know their gender. In Indonesian, the important thing is whether my sibling is older or younger, whether I have a kakak, which is older, or an adik, which is younger. You then have to ask, so is your older sibling a girl or a boy? Is your younger sibling a girl or a boy? Whereas in English, we say, oh, you've got a sister. Is she older or younger?
That's interesting. I
Yeah.
never thought about that, but the primary categorization by the words we use, the pronouns we use, doesn't have to be gender. You're right.
Yeah.
I can imagine age would be very important in some societies.
Yeah, exactly. So in Indonesian, age is the thing, and even the pronouns, very important. Now that we get asked preferred pronouns, he, she, or they, in Indonesian, it's just one word. Everybody is they, all the time. There is only they. You never know whether someone is talking about a man, a woman, or a trans person, or a non-binary person, or whoever, because they are always a they. Dia is the word.
Sharon does most of her fieldwork on the island of Sulawesi, just north of Bali. The Bugis people who live there recognize 5 genders.
There's makundrai, which is how people might conceptualize a feminine cisgender. So cis meaning that your gender fits the expectation. There's urane, which will be cisgender masculine men. And then there's 3 other kind of terms that can be applied to configurations of that. So chalalai being female-bodied masculine gender, chalabai being feminine male-bodied subjects.
The 5th term, Bissu, is closer to what we'd call non-binary or intersex in English, because Bissu are viewed as embodying all the genders. But for the Bugis, being Bissu also has an added element.
Bissu, kind of a spiritual, ritual, almost shamanistic type of category that in the origin narrative, so the stories that people tell about how the world started, Bissu are the beings who came down from the heavens but didn't split into any of these other kind of genders. Bissu maintained everything within their being. So all of the masculine, feminine elements maintained within that body. And with that power of all the genders, it enabled Bissu to be mediators between the gods and the people, the everyday people on earth, because they hadn't fully split into mere mortals. They still had this spiritual connection.
Historically, this meant that Bissu often played important roles in society as spiritual leaders and advisors to royalty. So when Christian and Muslim traders and colonizers eventually arrived in Sulawesi in the 13th century, it was often the Bissu they had to negotiate with.
One guy who came, his name was Depavia, wrote a lot about his experience in Sulawesi, and he was very keen for Sulawesi to become Christian. So, good trading relations could result if Sulawesi became Christian. They'd have a lot more in common. And so Depavia set out to convert everybody to Christianity, but he had no luck, really. And he was writing home these exasperated letters about what he was framing as the meddlesome Bissu. So he would approach the kings and queens of Sulawesi and give the best pitch for becoming Christian. And Depavia would write back to Portugal saying these Bissu are just there. They have all this power and they're telling the kings and queens that we shouldn't go with the Christians. But for Bissu, they saw Christianity as being too restrictive for their approach to the world.
Ultimately, Christianity's overly conservative stance on gender led the Bugis to favor Islam, which remains the dominant religion in Indonesia to this day.
They saw Islam as a religion that would tolerate and allow for gender diversity, and that Islam would also allow all of their kind of deities to become helpers of Allah. So, rather than humans going straight to one supreme being, for Bissu and for others, Islam allowed a way that their pre-Islamic gods and spiritual beliefs could be incorporated within that same system. So still having one supreme God, but Allah would have helpers. And so, that's part of the story of why Islam was just the more accommodating, more progressive religion.
Today, Indonesia is a republic. So the Bissu aren't advising royalty anymore, but many still fulfill a spiritual role.
The most common, at least that I have seen, and I've been working in this area since 1998, so quite a while now, one of the most common ones actually of the role is preparing and blessing people who are about to take the Hajj to Mecca. And so for many people that might be like, you're going to a pre-Islamic spiritual leader to bless you for your journey to Mecca. But that's precisely how that syncretic nature of Islam and Indonesian society have allowed the two to merge. So people, before they're making the pilgrimage, will go to Bissu. There'll be a ritual. So this will involve lots of different things. So nasi kuning, so big piles of yellow rice and lots of offerings around. There's an altar, usually with some cigarettes and a bit of money and a few other things. And then Bissu will perform a dance. And part of that dance is called the makgiri. And the makgiri is a way for Bissu to prove that they are in communication with the gods. So the best way to bless someone is to get one of the deities, so one of Allah's helpers, to get the all clear from the Almighty that you're good to go for that.
Of course, not everyone who has a non-binary identity embraces the spiritual role of Bissu. Bissu are supposed to be celibate, and the rituals they perform require a good deal of training, like the magiri, which involves pushing daggers into one's body without penetrating the skin.
Being able to perform the makgiri is the ultimate one to show that you can be possessed by these spiritual beings and able to bestow blessings. There's a Bissu language, and so mastering that language and being able to give incantations and blessings in Bissu language is important.
But since the mid-20th century, things have started to change. The Bissu's roles are not so prominent, and they are far fewer in number.
There's a lot of powerful stories of inclusion and tolerance and celebration, but for every one of those stories throughout Indonesia's history, there's probably 10 of persecution. So even in Sulawesi, there's been ups and downs. In the 1950s, there were pretty concerted efforts by Islamic groups, Kaha Muzaka, for instance, that really had a campaign to purge Bissu and all transgender categories. Many people were killed during this time. So there's always been ebbs and flows of kind of acceptance and persecution. And even now, it's such a complex story. So there's two kind of narratives happening. The narrative that gender diversity is pre-colonial, and Indonesia should celebrate this because it's not a colonial import. Western hedonism didn't bring us this gender diversity. It was here all along. So let's celebrate Indonesian history and culture and really make sure that there's a safe space for gender diversity. But now with increasingly an Islamic focus, Indonesia is undergoing a very conservative shift towards sexual criminalization. Just last year, for the first time in its history, Indonesia has criminalized same-sex sexuality. So homosexuality is now a crime for which you can go to prison. Gender diversity is also, there are sanctions on that.
In Sulawesi, gender diversity has always been a constant. What changes, as Sharon said, is its degree of acceptance. When the political and religious winds shift toward the conservative or are changed by colonization, intolerance can grow. But this isn't just the story in Indonesia. It's a common tale, one that happened right here in the United States, too.
Upon first contact with Europeans, over 130 tribes were known to have gender nonconforming or same-sex couples or this type of people living and thriving in amongst society, tribal society. This was a part of society. And the Europeans wrote about that in a derogatory manner, and they also were quite violent specifically to these people. My name is Marka Cassidy, and my Osage name is Huedoan, and my performance name is Marks Cassidy.
Marka has many names and wears many hats.
I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, a singer-songwriter, as well as an enrolled member of the Osage Nation, proud member of the Osage Nation. I wish it was an easier introduction, but there's many parts to me in my life.
And Marka, or Marks, will be using both of these names throughout the episode, also uses another term to describe themselves.
Two-Spirit is the term that means umbrella term that can mean an LGBTQ identified person who has Native American heritage. So if you don't have Native American heritage, it would be appropriation of the term if you use the term Two-Spirit for yourself.
The term Two-Spirit is fairly recent, but the idea behind it isn't. It was coined in the summer of 1990 at the 3rd Annual Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian Conference held in Winnipeg, Canada. The group that met there was familiar with the gender-fluid spiritual traditions, stories, and kinship communities that had characterized the lives of many tribes for centuries, but were now being forgotten. They wanted to find a collective identity that would call back to those traditions, rather than relying on offensive colonial terminology, or even labels like lesbian, gay, or trans, which were born out of a European understanding of gender. Two-Spirit, the term they landed on, is a translation from the Northern Algonquin word Nij Manitoag, which essentially means a person who has both masculine and feminine spirits. So even though the English use of Two-Spirit is relatively new, its linguistic roots run deep, and they're not limited to Northern Algonquin either. The historian Gregory Smithers talks about how, across the continent, many Native American languages avoid the use of gender pronouns, opting instead for words that would be similar to it or they. And traditionally, a number of these cultures also recognize and have language for a whole range of gender identities.
There's this word in Osage, mihoge, or in the Omaha Ponca, more pronunciations, mihoge. This word translates to English, a man guided by the moon. The moon being feminine, guiding a man masculine, so this is a feminine man.
But Marka didn't grow up knowing about mihoge. One of the ways early European colonizers terrorized indigenous communities was to regularly target gender-fluid people for violence. These attacks led to suppression of many traditions that recognized Two-Spirit people not only as integral parts of society, but often as community leaders and holders of sacred knowledge. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the attacks on Native people and their culture were also playing out across hundreds of federal boarding schools intended to assimilate Native children into European American culture. And a critical part of the curriculum in these schools centered on conforming to Western gender norms. Boys and girls received separate educations, with no tolerance for anyone who wanted to blend gender roles. Marka didn't attend such a school, but given that over 80% of Native children in the 20th century did, they felt the repercussions anyway.
I was born in 1967 in Ponca City, Oklahoma, and I was raised in the Osage Nation, the Osage Reservation of Oklahoma. Homosexuality was a diagnosable disorder until, I believe it was 1973. I was about 6 or 7 years old and was still living in the ramifications of that, along with fundamentalist Christianity. So that's kind of complex. Growing up in what we call the Bible Belt of Oklahoma on a Native reservation. In that era where we were in the 50s, people would be kicked out of college if they came out as a lesbian, these types of things. So we're still living in that era with all the institutions and the adults around me, colonized in their thinking and fearful in their thinking.
Some remnants of traditional knowledge remained, but they weren't always easy to find.
Within a certain tribe, you'd have to talk within certain families. I know people who grew up with their grandparent kind of taking them aside and going, you are mihoge, and this is who you are. It's okay to be that. But others who were affected by, depending on how their Christian values were being, exhibited. So there's a lot of don't ask, don't tell, a lot of hush hush, a lot of people just kind of being themselves and kind of being ostracized. Sometimes people, I'll ask them, how did you survive this? And they'll be like, you just say to hell with them, For me, it was not like that. I struggled greatly. Somehow I got a download that I shouldn't be on the earth. When I went to college in the mid-'80s, in the height of the AIDS crisis, which they called the gay plague in many places, including Oklahoma, it was very brutal. 2 girls had come out in my high school at Ponca City, and the whole town, not just the students, the faculty, the adults of my town attacked those young girls. Quite traumatic for me to witness them and kind of come out to myself and see what happens to people who come out in this way. We had no social media. There was no one on TV depicting queerness overtly, I ended up dropping out. I was a music major and I ended up dropping out and self-destructing pretty hardcore because I got messages around me that there was something wrong with me, that I didn't deserve to live, that I was defective. I was 21. I was hating myself, believing I should not be on the planet, suicide pact with another person who was queer. Through drug use, speed, cocaine use, intravenous, I was trying to kill myself. I was trying to get out of here, but couldn't quite do it. And I was out very high one night on speed. And this is not a hallucinogen I'm on. I'm on, some street speed stimulant, right? And I was leaning against a building in an Oklahoma thunderstorm, just out in the rain. Lightning struck the building that I was standing next to and knocked me across the lawn on my back. And I looked up into this lightning sky and I heard a strong voice come through me and say, "Stop killing yourself. You're here for a reason."
How did that change you, though, after you heard that voice from the lightning? What did you do or think next?
I got up, I got clean. I went to therapy. I went and started taking part in EMDR therapy, which is trauma-focused therapy. It took me a long time. I started singing songs about trauma and my experiences and singing them on stage. Pretty soon I got a radio show and I started talking to other people about how they use art to stay alive through PTSD or express themselves.
But that was just one part of the healing process. Before reconnecting with their own tradition, Marka embarked on a spiritual journey far from home.
I left Oklahoma in 1997 with a pretty solid case of PTSD from my own trauma around being queer, as well as my own trauma around being a first responder, an emergency room nurse. And the return for me to this identity came through other lineages from Africa, from Ecuador. Also a deep dive study of Vedanta. So I was in India and Nepal, where there's gender diversity there as well. Through, an Ecuadorian shaman doing a cleansing on me, telling me he sees this pain and harm in my DNA and that he is helping heal it and to return to my people and be who I am, to be in my identity, whatever that means. We didn't talk about being queer or being two-spirit, but there was an energetic understanding, as well as these teachers that were teaching me out loud from their own lineages what two-spirit people were, queer people within their societies.
Who's gonna take it? Take it off my hands. Who's gonna help me? Help me take a stand. Try to understand me. Not a woman, not a man.
In many cultures, there's not a binary. There's a gender spectrum. Some tribes, 7 genders, 5 genders. I had a teacher from the Dagara tribe, Burkina Faso in Africa, Sobampu Some, and in her people there still, that lineage, that role, gender identity is still alive. They call them the gatekeepers in English. She would tell me the people who are in same-sex marriages or who are gender diverse, they live on the edge of the village and they're the marriage counselors to the straight people.
These examples of gender diversity that Marka kept encountering in their travels were not just a coincidence. North American native peoples and Indonesian Bugis are anything but an exception when it comes to the ways people live. In fact, if you look around the world, you might think it's the cultures with a strict gender binary logic that deviate from the norm. Throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, many societies have a much more fluid understanding of gender, sex, and sexuality, with some even waiting until later in childhood or even puberty to assign gender. You can also find recognized third genders, as they're often called, in places as disparate as Mexico, Samoa, and Angola. And while many are increasingly facing discrimination and violence, they've also often had special roles to play in spiritual life. For example, in India and Bangladesh, Hijra, who trace their roots to Hindu mythology, are considered to have the power to give blessings and curses. Or Hawaii, where Mahu, which translates to in the middle, were traditionally respected as skillful healers and keepers of cultural knowledge. Among the Mapuche in Chile, the Machi are shamanic religious leaders whose gender-fluid identity is seen as what gives them the ability to interact with the spiritual realm. In fact, shamans around the world have a long history of being gender-fluid to some degree.
So yes, once I started embracing that and also coming home, I made some albums, I would sing some songs, and I was asked to sing at the inauguration of our chief in Congress at one point back here in Oklahoma. I started showing up for those kinds of things, speaking and talking as a therapist, as a songwriter. What I hear from LGBTQ Native elders is they want honoring and visibility. Same with the youth. They want honoring and visibility. It's very simple. They want someone to just say, hello, I honor you. You are welcome here. I'll use your whatever pronouns. I'll use whatever name. You can wear regalia. You can dance in whatever powwow category you want to. It just brings things out of the shadow.
But that shadow remains all too prevalent for many.
I saw a statistic that in 2020, 33% of LGBTQ Native American youth attempted suicide. And I was shocked, not surprised, but shocked.
According to the Trevor Project, queer Native American youth consistently report the highest suicide risk across race and ethnicity. And it's not just young people. Over 80% of transgender, gay, lesbian, and two-spirit Native people are the victims of physical violence at some point in their lives. Recognizing these facts, this pain, led Marks to act. And being an artist, they had a perfect way.
Immediately, I saw a grant from Indian Collective called the Radical Imagination Grant. And I wrote to them with this passion and said, I want to write a 10-song album and use my songwriting skills and to make a music video that depicts religious trauma and colonization within Two-Spirit society and the upliftment through community healing. They said, yes, go for it.
This time, the spiritual journey that Marks embarked on led homeward.
When I was writing this album, I say it wasn't really like writing it. I would get woken up at 4 a.m. once I was in this current of writing for these youth and my own inner child, right? I started realizing I'm being given material from ancestors' guides. Sometimes I say the transcestors, from before. And sometimes, just I would get whole lyrics or verses or bridge ideas and a lot of encouragement to keep going. I'd start to check myself like, whoa, my wife, and she'd be like, no, keep going, and encouraging me. Because that when I'm in that identity, often I talk with clients, it doesn't really matter if you're making it up or not. If it makes life better and you're treating yourself better and you're loving yourself better. At one point, I was asking at 4 a.m., why is it 4 a.m. you're waking me up? Can I sleep a little longer? And they're like, no, this is when you're quiet. This is when you're gonna, and I'm like, okay, great.
Shining the light of visibility. Two-spirit people returning, decolonize our sexuality and get to know ourselves a little better.
This is a rediscovery. This is a reclaiming. This is the wave we are in as Native people. You can see it in literature, film, TV, movie, reservation dogs, music, fashion. It's happening, as well as in gender and sexuality, the decolonization. And so I'm on a mission. The reason I'm back in Oklahoma at this time in my life as a therapist and somebody with privilege, I know that someone might hear or see something that I do and come out and speak out loud about. And I have to say, this is very vulnerable. It is hard. I have people who, push back and say, who are you? Because that happens. Trolling, social media. It's like this kind of, ouch. It shakes me. And why do I do this? I came out with a music video in August, and already I've been getting people writing to me saying, my brother is Native and he's gay and he hates himself. He's having a really hard time. I showed him the music video and it's helping. That's what's important.
Smoke out that hatred and fear inside your mind. Let's get to know each other.
But music is just one way Marka is fighting the battle against Two-Spirit and LGBTQ trauma.
As a therapist, I try to first just join people wherever they're at, and that's whoever I'm talking to. I just meet people where they're at, and again, this is where sometimes as a musician and as a therapist, I feel like I do, as a Two-Spirit person, as a Mihoge person, have a capacity for listening. And I do believe that is part of my identity. I listen, and here I am. It's vulnerable. I do the best I can. I know that my own way of being a therapist or a songwriter is not for everyone. But for those it is, it really lands, and that's been true for me in my life.
So for younger people growing up now, is the idea of Two-Spirit reducing some of that stigma that came in as a result of colonization and conversion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say this. I don't represent all Native American people. I don't represent all Osages or all Two-Spirit people. I don't represent all Mihoge people. I'm having my own experience, as is every Native person. But I would say, in speaking with clients and in showing up to groups and talking forums around the nation, yes, this word Two-Spirit or indigiqueer or people's individual words is helping. It is bringing representation and visibility in a new way. I think any level of visibility for queer people of any type is important.
Do you think it's also, besides providing people with language to talk about how they understand their gender identity, do you think it's also providing pride in the sense of, hey, look, our nations, our people recognize this and valued it. And so it's not the case that all over the world there are only two genders in this binary distinction. Do you think it's working in that larger sense of pride for your history as well?
I believe so. This is again why I show up to talk, is like I want folks to know, as I've been studying and as a therapist working with LGBTQ people and Two-Spirit people, that gender diversity is nothing new. It's old. It's very old. And that's important because there's a lot of propaganda that goes out about how this is a fad. Like this thing, they, them pronouns. We're very creative as humans. We have a creator and it creates through us and we get creative. And this is one way that we're expressing this very old thing that has been in tribal societies around the world forever, but we're using our creativity to express it in a new way. They, them pronouns, singular use, freaks everybody out. People are like, what is this? And also for non-Native people, if this uplifts non-Native people too as a talking point, because everybody comes from tribal societies from somewhere around the world. And I believe in all those tribal societies around the world, there has always been gender diversity.
It seems to me that one of the most difficult things being human is to feel like you don't fit, is to feel like you're aberrant in some way. And in some sense, terms like Two-Spirit and recognizing the history and the validity of gender diversity across societies just gets rid of othering. And that, I think, is a single yet really powerful thing, just feeling you belong and there's not something wrong or aberrant.
Yeah, and like you said, that's true for all people. Existentially, we are all in challenge being here on this rock that goes around the sun and with nerve endings that bring pleasure and pain all at the same time. Who thought of that? The mystery, the great mystery. Like how do we navigate it all together? Nick Tilson, one mentor that I love, he's a Lakota guy. who leads Indian Collective, he talks about, as Native Americans, people romanticize our history, but nobody romanticizes our history better than us. He's like, what if our best days are ahead of us? What if we continue in our identities, in our lineages, in our land back manifesto, which is the return of land back, but also culture, ceremony, medicine, kinship. And within kinship, I say sexuality and gender. What if we decolonize sexuality and gender in Native nations, but across all the construct? What would it be like here? More accepting, more loving, perhaps more spiritual, more in touch with earth-based spirituality rather than externalized, fear-based, power grab, power over type of religion, or the way religion can be used for that.
For a long time, we often use the terms sex and gender interchangeably in English, but they're not the same thing. Gender is an identity, one defined by each person and the society around them. Sometimes that joint project is one of welcoming and acceptance. At others, it's a source of tension and pain. But as we've seen, the gender binary isn't written in stone. How modern societies navigate questions raised by gender diversity continues to evolve. But especially in religiously pluralistic societies like the U.S., arguments against it shouldn't rest on the erroneous assumption that gender diversity is somehow a dangerous new secular creation. It is, and always has been, part of the human and spiritual experience. Next time on How God Works, religion can feel pretty dry at times. Recite a prayer here, light a candle there. But is that really all there is?
Tell you the truth, I think that the mystical experience is what people are pointing to in their religious lives. The moments when you are completely present to who you are, what you are, and wide open inside. And they tend to be some of the most joyous, profound experiences people have ever had.
And they're not as rare as you might think. From church services to witnessing beauty in the natural world to magic mushrooms, people are finding ways to touch the transcendent, to have some big feelings that change them in big ways.
What I felt was more awe and wonder for the world, more fascinated in small things, and maybe this is the major thing, much more connected to family and friends.
Join us next time to learn more about how, where, and why more and more people are on the mystic path. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. April Franklin is our intern. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org, or follow me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.